At the acquisition meeting, the CEO's nephew smugly announced, "Take your 2 weeks and go quietly," in front of all the buyers. I just smiled and pulled out my business card that said, "Interim COO." His face went white. The moment I watched Travis's confident smirk dissolve into pure confusion was worth every sleepless night I'd spent these past 8 months cleaning up his disasters. There he was, all 28 years of unearned privilege and jawline genetics, expecting me to pack up my desk like a dismissed intern while 4 executives from Nordell Systems watched his little power play unfold. What he didn't realize was that those same executives had been quietly working with me for the past 2 months. The business card I'd just handed across the mahogany table wasn't a resignation letter, it was his termination notice. I'm Carol Ellis, and up until this moment, I'd been the Senior Vice President of Operations at Core Sentry, a $600 million logistics company that I'd personally built from a chaotic startup into an acquisition target. My annual salary of $185,000, combined with stock options and performance bonuses, had made me financially independent enough to weather any corporate storm. More importantly, my 15 years in operations management had taught me that the most devastating battles in business aren't fought with raised voices or dramatic exits. They're won through documentation, strategic patience, and knowing exactly which contracts nobody bothers to read. Travis Harrison, nephew to our recently retired CEO, had waltzed into the company 3 months ago with a badge he'd printed himself and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Leader." His qualifications consisted of an MBA from a school that advertised during daytime television and 2 years managing his father's car dealership into near bankruptcy. But family connections had secured him the interim CEO position during our acquisition process. He'd spent every day since trying to remake the company in his own image of buzzword-heavy incompetence. What made this moment particularly satisfying was the careful, strategic work I'd been doing behind the scenes. While Travis hosted Transformation Thursdays in the break room and sent company-wide emails about disrupting legacy workflows, I'd been quietly corresponding with Maya Brennan, Nordell's Vice President of Integration. I provided her team with the operational continuity frameworks they needed to ensure a smooth acquisition. Unlike Travis's colorful PowerPoint presentations, my contributions were documented, systematic, and absolutely critical to the $600 million deal he was now trying to take credit for. The 4 Nordell executives seated around the table represented serious private equity money from Chicago. These were the kind of professionals who could smell operational incompetence faster than Travis could conjugate synergy. They'd flown in specifically for this final integration meeting, and Travis had apparently decided it would be the perfect venue to publicly dismiss the person who'd been their primary operational contact for the past 60 days. His strategic thinking was about as sharp as a bowling ball. But what truly made Travis's power play spectacular in its stupidity was the document he'd signed 2 weeks ago, a seemingly routine transition staffing agreement that he'd approved without reading. Page 14, paragraph 3, subsection E, specifically designated me as the continuity lead with sole authority over all staffing decisions related to transition phase operational personnel. Authority that may not be overridden by temporary or interim executives not ratified by the board. Travis wasn't board ratified. He was just CEO adjacent through DNA. He just handed me the legal authority to override every personnel decision he'd made. The beauty of strategic patience is that it allows you to watch your opponents defeat themselves while you simply document the process. For 3 months, I'd been keeping meticulous records of Travis's decisions. From the compliance software migration he'd ordered without legal review that froze 5 critical vendor accounts, to the optimization of our invoicing workflow that removed 2 approval steps required for SEC compliance. Every missed deadline, every confused email thread, every panicked call from department heads trying to circumvent his incompetence. All of it carefully cataloged in a system that would make any forensic accountant weep with joy. My professional network had become crucial during this period. Through my previous work with acquisition due diligence, I'd developed relationships with attorneys specializing in corporate transitions, compliance consultants who understood regulatory requirements, and operational experts who could quickly assess systemic risks. When Nordell's team reached out for informal alignment discussions, I wasn't just prepared to answer their questions. I was able to provide comprehensive analysis backed by 15 years of operational experience and 3 months of watching Travis systematically undermine everything I'd built. The financial implications of this moment extended far beyond my personal job security. Core Sentry employed 847 people across 12 locations, and the Nordell acquisition represented their financial stability for the foreseeable future. Travis's leadership style, which consisted primarily of delegating everything to his fraternity brother Bryce while he sketched flowcharts on butcher paper, had already caused 3 major vendor relationships to deteriorate. It created compliance gaps that could have derailed the entire acquisition. My quiet work with Nordell's integration team hadn't just been about survival. It had been about ensuring that 847 families didn't lose their livelihoods because of one overprivileged nephew's corporate cosplay. The documentation folder I'd been building over these months read like a masterclass in systematic organizational failure. Every time Travis removed me from leadership briefings, I'd forwarded the cancellation emails to my personal account with timestamps and context notes. Every vendor negotiation he derailed with his disruptive approaches, I'd quietly handled through backup channels while maintaining detailed records of the original failures. Every compliance deadline he'd missed while hosting brainstorming sessions with beanbag chairs, I'd managed through direct relationships with regulatory contacts while documenting the gaps his approach created. What Travis fundamentally misunderstood about corporate acquisitions is that buyers aren't purchasing ideas or vision statements. They're purchasing operational systems and the people who understand them. Nordell wasn't paying $600 million for Travis's synergy presentations. They were paying for the logistics networks, vendor relationships, compliance frameworks, and institutional knowledge that kept Core Sentry profitable. I was the person who'd built most of those systems, maintained the critical relationships, and understood the operational complexities that made the acquisition valuable. Travis was just the person who'd spent 3 months trying to disrupt everything the buyers actually wanted to purchase. The irony of his dismissal announcement was that it demonstrated exactly why Nordell's executives had quietly structured the transition agreement to protect their actual operational assets. While Travis thought he was demonstrating decisive leadership by firing me, he was actually revealing to the buyers that he fundamentally didn't understand what they were acquiring, or why I was essential to protecting their investment. The yellow sticky note I'd spotted peeking out from the Nordell CEO's binder marked page 14 of that transition agreement. I knew that Travis was about to learn the difference between having authority and having power. My strategic preparation for this moment had been methodical and comprehensive. I'd maintained detailed vendor contact lists, documented all critical process workflows, created backup systems for every essential operation. Most importantly, I'd built the professional relationships that would allow Core Sentry to continue functioning regardless of who occupied the executive suite. Travis had spent his time creating PowerPoint presentations about transformation. I'd spent mine ensuring there would still be a company to transform when the dust settled. The business card I'd handed to the Nordell CEO wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the culmination of 2 months of careful relationship building, strategic positioning, and operational excellence. While Travis hosted synergy sessions and sent motivational emails about embracing change, I'd been quietly demonstrating to the buyers that I understood their needs, shared their priorities, and possessed the operational expertise necessary to protect their investment. The card read, Carol R. Ellis, Interim COO, Transition Operations Americas, Nordell Systems. Every word on it had been earned through professional competence rather than family connections. As I watched the Nordell CEO examine my card and then share it with the legal representative seated beside him, I could see the moment when Travis began to realize that this meeting wasn't unfolding according to his script. The confident smile that had carried him through 3 months of operational disasters was starting to flicker as he processed the fact that the buyers seemed more interested in my business card than his farewell speech. He'd walked into this meeting expecting to demonstrate his authority by dismissing me in front of the acquisition team. Instead, he was about to learn that real authority comes from competence, relationships, and strategic thinking, rather than family connections and motivational slogans. The strategic planning that had brought me to this moment began the day Travis first removed me from a cross-functional leadership call, claiming that operations shouldn't be involved in strategic discussions. Instead of fighting his decision or appealing to his minimal authority, I'd simply documented the exclusion and begun building alternative channels of communication with the stakeholders who actually understood operational requirements. When vendor issues arose that Travis couldn't solve, department heads began reaching out to me directly, creating a shadow operational structure that kept the company functioning while he focused on rebranding initiatives and transformation workshops. My approach to this crisis had been informed by 15 years of experience managing complex transitions and organizational changes. I understood that emotional reactions and public confrontations might feel satisfying in the moment, but they rarely produce lasting strategic advantages. Instead, I'd focused on maintaining operational excellence, building stakeholder relationships, and positioning myself as the person who could ensure continuity during a period of systematic leadership failure. Every decision I'd made over the past 3 months had been calculated to demonstrate competence while documenting incompetence, creating a clear contrast that sophisticated buyers would recognize and value. The financial modeling I'd prepared for Nordell's due diligence team had required hundreds of hours of detailed analysis. I examined everything from vendor cost structures and compliance requirements to workflow optimization opportunities and risk mitigation strategies. This wasn't busy work or resume padding. It was the kind of comprehensive operational assessment that private equity firms require before spending $600 million on an acquisition. Travis's contribution to the due diligence process had consisted mainly of forwarding my analyses, with cover emails claiming credit for work he didn't understand and couldn't replicate. As the Nordell CEO began to explain the transition staffing agreement to his increasingly pale nephew, I reflected on the systematic nature of what had just unfolded. Travis's downfall hadn't resulted from any single dramatic mistake or personality conflict. It had been the inevitable consequence of persistent incompetence meeting professional accountability. His approach to leadership had been based on the assumption that authority derives from position and personality rather than competence and relationships. He'd never understood that sophisticated business partners evaluate leaders based on actual performance rather than confident presentations. The documentation system I'd maintained throughout this period would serve as a valuable case study for future transition management. It demonstrated how operational continuity can be preserved even when nominal leadership fails to understand basic business requirements. Every email thread, every vendor escalation, every missed deadline, all of it systematically recorded with timestamps, context, and impact analysis. Travis had created the mess, but I documented it, managed around it, and ultimately leveraged it to demonstrate the value of professional operational management versus amateur hour executive performance. The room's atmosphere shifted dramatically as the Nordell CEO finished explaining the contractual language that transferred operational authority from Travis to me for the next 90 days of integration. The private equity executives who'd been watching Travis's presentation with polite skepticism were now engaged and focused, asking specific questions about timeline management and resource allocation. HR representatives who'd been nodding along with dismissal procedures were suddenly taking notes about transition protocols and reporting structures. Even Bryce, Travis's fraternity brother and director of strategic transformation, had stopped whispering into his phone and was staring at the contract documents with obvious confusion. Travis's attempts to challenge the authority transfer demonstrated exactly why the transition agreement had been structured to protect operational decision-making from his influence. He'd signed a legally binding document without understanding its implications, approved corporate structures he couldn't explain, and authorized personnel decisions he wasn't qualified to evaluate. His objections weren't based on operational requirements or business strategy. They were simply emotional reactions to discovering that real business relationships are built on competence and performance, rather than family connections and motivational speaking. The moment when the Nordell CEO announced Travis's reassignment to Facility Operations in Kansas City Shift B nights represented perfect justice, calibrated to his actual skill level. After 3 months of treating operational management as beneath his strategic vision, he was being assigned to the kind of hands-on operational role he'd consistently dismissed as unimportant. The temperature comment about air drop 10 degrees was particularly fitting for someone who'd spent his tenure complaining about the complexity of managing basic business functions in a climate-controlled office environment. My acceptance of the Nordell credentials marked the official transition from Travis's leadership fantasy to professional operational management. The badge that HR handed me wasn't just identification. It was formal recognition of the authority and responsibility I'd been exercising informally for months, while Travis focused on rebranding initiatives and transformation workshops. Every vendor relationship I'd maintained, every compliance deadline I'd managed, every crisis I'd resolved while he sketched flowcharts on butcher paper. All of it had led to this moment when competence finally received appropriate authority. The strategic lesson embedded in this entire experience extends far beyond personal career management into fundamental questions about leadership, competence, and organizational accountability. Travis's approach had been based on the assumption that confident presentation and family connections could substitute for operational expertise and stakeholder relationships. My approach had focused on building actual value through systematic competence and professional performance. The acquisition process had simply provided an objective framework for evaluating which approach actually delivers results in high-stakes business situations. As I walked out of that conference room with my new credentials and 90 days of operational authority, I reflected on how different this outcome might have been if I'd responded to Travis's initial dismissals with emotional reactions or public confrontations. Instead, strategic patience and professional excellence had created opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible through traditional organizational politics or family connections. Travis learned too late that real authority derives from competence and relationships rather than position and personality. I demonstrated that systematic preparation and professional performance ultimately triumph over privilege and presentation skills. The final irony of Travis's situation was that his new assignment in Kansas City actually represented an opportunity to develop the operational competence he'd never acquired through family connections and MBA programs. Managing forklift schedules and facility operations might teach him valuable lessons about the complexity of systems he'd previously dismissed as beneath his strategic vision. Of course, given his track record with logistics software and vendor management, the Kansas City facility team was probably already preparing comprehensive backup plans to ensure their operations survived his learning curve.